Id, you just threw away $90 on scrap. Marshal Coburn's voice tore through the Hadley County auction barn, and the whole room burst out laughing. Id, $90. The boy spent $90 on a chunk of burnt metal. Somebody better check his pockets, because that kind of money doesn't come honest. The laughter climbed until it rattled the rafters. But Elias Carver did not so much as blink. He simply gathered up that fire-scorched hotel safe nobody else wanted to touch and began the long walk home. And none of them had any idea that this boy had a locksmith's gift in his fingers, and that ruined hunk of steel held the truth behind the fire that had killed his father 16 years earlier. If you've ever had someone write you off the moment you opened your mouth, stay with this one to the end, because what he found inside that box changed absolutely everything. The laughter was still echoing through the auction barn rafters when Elias gathered his money back into a neat stack and slid it across the table to the clerk. He didn't look up at the crowd. He'd learned over 16 years, as the only Carver boy in Hadley County, that meeting the eyes of people who were laughing only fed the laughter further. He was 17 that spring, the lean kind of build boys get from working harder than they eat, with hands that seemed almost too steady and patient for a kid his age. Hugh's hands were the whole reason he had a trade in the first place. For 2 years he had swept floors, oiled tumblers, and sorted blank keys in the back room of the only locksmith shop in town, a narrow brick storefront on Larkin Street belonging to an older white man named Walt Pemberton. Walt was old enough to remember things most of the town would rather have forgotten. And there was something in the way he sometimes looked at Elias, a flicker that resembled guilt, something the boy had never understood and had stopped trying to ask about long ago. What Elias understood was steel. He understood the quiet little music a lock made as its pins settled into place, the way a well-built mechanism would speak to anyone who knew how to listen for it. Walt always said the boy had been born with that ear. He also said, on the rare evenings when he'd had enough to drink to grow honest, that Elias wasn't the first Carver to have it. He never finished that thought. He'd set his cup down. His face would shut like a door swinging closed, and that would be the end of the conversation. Fire was the one thing nobody in town ever finished talking about either. 16 years back, the Whitfield Hotel had burned down to its foundation on a cold January night, and a man had died inside. That man was Elias's father, Marcus Carver, though the boy had no memory of him at all, only a faded photograph and a story everybody else in Hadley County seemed to know better than he did. His story went that Marcus had been inside that burning hotel when he had no business being there. And the polite version of the tale stopped right there. The cruel version, the one boys had thrown at Elias across schoolyards his entire life, claimed that Marcus Carver had gone into the Whitfield to help himself to whatever a wealthy dying man might leave lying around, and that the fire had been Lord's own verdict on the matter. Elias never believed a word of it, but he had also never managed to disprove it, and in a town like Hadley, that was nearly the same thing as it being true. So when the auction listing went up that week, pinned to the post office board and read aloud at the feed store, and Elias saw the words Whitfield Hotel Fireproof Safe, Contents Unknown, to be sold, something in his chest went very still. The hotel itself was long gone. The land had changed hands more than once. But the safe had survived the fire the way only a heavy old thing can, and it had been sitting in a county storage shed for 16 years until somebody finally decided hauling it out for auction was worth the trouble. It was the last object his father had ever touched, and Elias was as certain of that as he was of almost nothing else in his life. Whatever Marcus Carver had been doing in that hotel the night it burned, he had been doing it near that very safe, and the steel had outlived him. Now it was about to be sold to whoever raised a hand and a dollar. Elias had $90 rolled tight inside a sock, hidden under a loose floorboard, in the rented room he kept above the hardware store. It had taken him 2 years of swept floors to save that much, dollar by dollar, and it was every single cent he owned in the world. He brought all of it. The auction barn out on the county road was packed that Saturday. the way it always got once the weather warmed, and people showed up as much for the entertainment as the merchandise. His Marshal Coburn was there, of course. Coburn was the man who bought up everything in Hadley County. He owned the failed lumber mill on the old Whitfield land, and half the storefronts on Larkin Street. And he drove a long white Cadillac that he parked across 2 spaces like he was daring anybody to say something about it. He stood with his thumbs tucked into his belt and his chin tipped back, surveying any room like he already owned the air inside it. To Marshal Coburn, the price tag on a thing was the entire truth of that thing. He had never once in his life recognized a value that didn't arrive with a number stamped on the side, and he certainly never expected to find one belonging to a carver. His safe came up near the very end, after the tractors, the tools, and a church pew nobody wanted. 2 men wheeled it out on a hand truck, and the whole room got a good look. It was an ugly thing, no question. The fire had scorched it black and warped the door so badly that one corner had pulled clean away from the frame. The brass dial had turned the color of an old penny. It looked exactly like what the catalog claimed it was, a ruined box that nobody had managed to open in 16 years. Contents unknown, the auctioneer announced, and a few men chuckled, because everybody already knew the only contents of a hotel safe gone cold for 16 years were soot and disappointment. He'll open the bidding at, let's say, $25. Nobody moved. A safe you couldn't open was worth less than the scrap sitting inside it, and the scrap in this particular one would cost more to haul away than it would ever bring in. Elias raised his hand. It was a small gesture, but the room caught it the way a quiet room always catches movement, and heads turned. He felt the weight of all that attention land on him, and he kept his arm raised anyway. 25 from the young man, the auctioneer said, a thread of amusement in his voice he didn't bother hiding. For one moment Elias thought it might really be that simple. Then Marshal Coburn turned, sized up the boy with the raised hand, and a slow grin spread beneath his mustache. He didn't want the safe. Everybody in that barn could see plainly that he didn't want the safe. What he wanted was the sport of it, and a carver boy, spending money he obviously couldn't afford, was the best entertainment to come through Hadley County in a long while. "30, Coburn called out, lazy as a man swatting a fly. The crowd stirred, delighted. Elias's jaw tightened. He had exactly $90, and not 1 cent more, and Coburn had a Cadillac parked across 2 spaces. The boy hadn't walked all the way out to the county road just to walk home with nothing. 40. He said. His voice didn't shake, which surprised even him. 50, Coburn answered before the auctioneer could even repeat the number, now half-turned so the crowd could watch his face along with the bidding. 60, 70. Coburn shook his head in mock amazement. Lord, look at him go. 80. The barn had gone loud now, with the kind of laughter that has real cruelty folded inside it, and the auctioneer was grinning openly, glancing back and forth between the towering white man and the lean black teenager like he was refereeing a fight. Elias's heart was slamming against his ribs. 90, Elias said. It was the number that emptied every pocket he owned. It was 2 full years of his life, spoken out loud, in front of a barn packed with people who thought his entire existence was a punchline. The word came out of him steady, and it landed in the room, and for one suspended moment there was nothing left on the other side of it but Marshal Coburn's grin. Coburn let the silence stretch until every eye in the place belonged to him, and then he threw his hands wide and laughed. You know what? Keep it. Keep your boat anchor, oh son. He turned back toward his neighbors, shaking his head, washing his hands of the whole foolish business with a showman's flourish. I'm not about to stand here and rob a child of his life savings over a chunk of burnt iron. Let him have his treasure. The laughter swelled even louder than before, because now the joke was complete, and Elias stood alone right in the middle of the punchline. Going once, the auctioneer managed, wiping his eyes. Going twice. Sold to the young man for $90. Elias walked to the front and laid his money down. $90 counted out, bill by bill, onto the clerk's table. When it was finished, there was nothing left rolled in that sock. nothing left under the loose floorboard at home. He counted it without a single word, and didn't let his hand shake while he did it. When it was done, he turned and looked at the safe instead of the crowd. "Son," the auctioneer said, not unkindly, lowering his voice to something almost private. "You understand we don't deliver. That thing's yours right where it sits. East weigh 400 pounds. "I know," Elias said. It was the first thing he'd said above a whisper since walking through the door. What happened next, the town would talk about for a long while, though not in the way Coburn had intended. The boy went outside to where he'd left a flatbed handcart, the kind used for hauling feed sacks, and wheeled it back in through the big barn doors. He then, alone, in front of a room full of people who had just finished laughing at him, Elias Carver set his shoulder against 400 pounds of warped steel and began to move it. It didn't go easily. It didn't go fast. He rocked it up onto one corner and walked it forward inch by grinding inch, the only way you move something that outweighs you. His whole body bent into the effort. Nobody stepped up to help. A few men shouted advice that was really just more laughter, dressed up as helpfulness. Coburn watched with his arms crossed over his chest, that same lazy certainty written across his face, enjoying the struggle nearly as much as he'd enjoyed the bidding war. And Elias let them all watch. That was the part that unsettled some of them later, thinking back on it. The boy never hurried to escape their eyes. He didn't flush, didn't curse, didn't beg for a hand. He worked the safe onto the cart and lashed it down tight with a length of rope, and through the whole ordeal he wore an expression with no shame in it, anywhere, only a kind of quiet, terrible patience, as if he and that steel had an appointment none of them had been invited to. He had bet $90 he could not spare against a box no man had managed to open in 16 years. He told the whole county had already decided he would fail, and most of them had spent their certainty freely in laughter. He knew nothing about his ears, nothing about whose ears they had belonged to first. All they knew was the price tag, the same way Marshal Coburn only ever knew the price tag. Elias took up the cart handles, leaned into the weight, and began the long walk home with his father's safe. That walk should have taken 20 minutes. It took Elias the better part of 2 hours, because 400 pounds doesn't roll. It crawls, and a handcart built for feed sacks groans under that kind of weight with every turn of its wheels. He kept to the shoulder of the county road, as the afternoon stretched long and golden, leaning his whole weight into the handles, stopping every 50 yards or so, to let his arms quit shaking before pushing on again. He was nearly to the edge of town, where the county road turned into Larkin Street, and the gravel gave way to cracked pavement, when he heard an engine slow down behind him. It was a pickup truck, and he recognized the 3 young men inside, before they even pulled even with him. They were the sons of Coburn's foreman and cousins to his hired hands, the kind Tom boys raised to believe their last names came with built-in permission. The driver, a heavy-set kid named Wade Tatum, leaned his elbow out the window and coasted along at Elias's walking pace, slow enough that the engine bucked and grumbled beneath him. "Here he is," Wade called out loud enough for the others to laugh, "the richest fool in Hadley County." Elias didn't look at them. He had already heard that afternoon what the town had decided to believe, and he heard it echoed again now in the way Wade said it. The story had traveled faster than he had, the way an ugly story always does. A Carver boy with $90. Where does a boy like that get $90? The question wasn't really a question at all. It was an accusation dressed up as a shrug, and by supper it would be settled fact in half the kitchens in town that Elias must have stolen the money from somewhere, because the actual truth, that he'd swept floors for 2 years to save it, was nowhere near as satisfying a story. The truck nosed ahead and swung onto the shoulder, angling across his path so he had to stop. The 3 of them climbed out, taking their time, and stood in a loose half-circle around the cart. They didn't lay a hand on him, that wasn't quite their style. But Wade put one boot up on the lip of the cart and gave the safe a shove, testing how it sat. And the whole thing rocked hard enough that Elias had to throw his weight against the handles to keep it from tipping into the ditch. Careful, Elias said. It was the only word he gave them. Careful, Wade repeated, grinning, and shoved it again, lighter this time, just to watch the boy scramble. Hey, what if you got in there anyway? Your daddy leave you something. One of the others snorted. Heard your daddy went into the Whitfield to clean the place out, and the Lord turned the lights off on him. Cat, what you're after, finishing the job he started. The words were meant to land somewhere soft, and they did. Elias felt them go in, but he had plenty of practice not showing exactly where he'd been hit. He simply held the cart steady and waited, looking past the three of them toward the bend in the road where Home sat, until standing there taunting a boy who refused to take the bait stopped being any fun at all. After a while, Wade pulled his boot off the cart, told Elias to enjoy his garbage, and the three of them climbed back into the truck and roared off toward town, leaving him standing in the settling dust. Elias stood there a moment, breathing. Then he picked the handles back up and kept going. By the time he got the safe up the outside stairs to his rented room above the hardware store, the light was nearly gone. The room was small, one window, a bed, and a table he'd built himself out of crate wood, and the safe took up most of the floor. Once he finally rocked it off the cart and let it down with a thud heavy enough to shake dust loose from the boards. He stood over it in the dimness, this thing he had given 2 years, and every dollar he owned to hold, and for the first time since the auctioneer's hammer fell, he let himself feel exactly how tired he was. Then he lit the oil lamp, because the room had no electric light he could afford to run, and he knelt down in front of his father's safe and got to work. The dial was the first problem, and a bad one. The fire hadn't just blackened the brass. It had reached down into the mechanism beneath the dial, and Elias understood the instant he laid his fingers on it that the heat had done something cruel in there. The safe's combination works through a stack of small notched wheels, and when the right numbers bring all the notches into a single line, a lever drops and the bolt is free to slide. He had learned all of this in Walt's back room, taking apart the same practice locks over and over until the logic of them lived permanently in his hands. Yet that logic assumed the wheels could still turn cleanly. When he pressed his ear to the door and worked the dial, what he heard wasn't the small, clean music a healthy lock makes. It was a grinding, a dragging sound, metal that had melted just slightly and cooled back into a shape it was never built to hold. The spindle, the central post the dial turns, had warped, not by much, a craftsman's worth of almost nothing, a fraction of an inch. But a lock lives entirely in fractions, and that small warp meant every wheel inside was now dragging against its neighbors, all of them fighting him at once. He could have forced it open. A man with a torch and no patience and no care for what was inside could have cut that safe apart in an afternoon, the way the county had probably been tempted to do a dozen times over those 16 years. Yet Elias hadn't spent $90 to destroy the last thing his father had died beside. He wanted it open, and he wanted it whole. The only tool he had for that job was the one he'd been born with, and could neither buy nor borrow, the patience to listen to a mechanism that didn't particularly want to talk. He settled in. The hours grew strange the way they always do for someone alone, with one task deep into the night. Outside, Larkin Street emptied. The hardware store below went dark. The last truck rattled past some time before midnight, and after that there was nothing left but the small hiss of the oil lamp, the boy's own breathing, and the steady, careful click of the dial under his fingers. He worked the first wheel, feeling for the spot where its drag eased, where the notch wanted to settle. It took him far longer than it had ever taken on any of Walt's practice locks, because the warp lied to him through false catches, made every wheel feel like the right one until he tested it, and the lever stayed put. His hands started giving out long before his patience did. The dial was small, and the fire had pitted its edges, and turning it 1,000 times, 10,000 times, with the firm, steady pressure the work demanded, wore the skin of his fingers raw. A blister rose at the base of his thumb and broke open, and the brass turned slick beneath it, and he wiped his hand on his trousers and kept going. Nobody was there to see him do it, and nobody was there to see what it was costing him. And somewhere in those small hours, that fact stopped feeling lonely and started feeling almost sacred. It was only him and the steel and whatever his father had left, sealed inside it. He thought about Marcus Carver more in those hours than he had in his entire life up to that point. He had no memories of the man at all, only the soft old photograph and the cruel story, and into that empty space he had always been careful never to pour too much hope. Because hope was the kind of thing that could be taken right back from you. He'd learned young to keep it small, but kneeling there with his ear pressed against the warm metal, he let himself wonder. These Walt's unfinished sentences kept coming back to him, the way the old man would say, "You're not the first Carver with those ears," and then trail off and reach for his cup. Elias had always written it off as the loose talk of a man who'd had too much to drink. Now in the dark, with his father's safe sitting beneath his bleeding hands, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like the edge of an answer. The first wheel found its line a little after midnight. He felt it more than heard it, a softening, a place where the drag eased, and the wheel settled into where it wanted to be. He held his breath and turned slowly the other direction to bring up the second wheel. The second was worse. The warp deepened the further the wheels stacked, and the second wheel fought him for nearly an hour, throwing false catch after false catch, each one lifting his hope, and then dropping it right back down. His knees ached against the floorboards. The oil in the lamp burned low, and he trimmed the wick and kept working, and it finally came. A little after 1 in the morning, he felt the second notch settle in line behind the first. And now only one wheel remained between Elias Carver and whatever 16 years had been holding back from him. And that last wheel would not move at all. This was the exact thing he had been dreading, since he first put his ear to that door and heard the grinding. The fire had done its worst damage at the back of this stack, nearest the outer face of the door, where the steel ran thinnest and the heat had burned hottest. The third wheel hadn't simply warped. It had fused, just slightly, to the post it rode on, welded by the fire into one seized piece, and no amount of careful turning was ever going to bring its notch around to the line, because it would not turn. It simply would not turn. Elias sat back on his heels in the failing lamplight, and for the first time all night, the patience drained out of him. It went all at once, the way air leaves something that's been holding it too long. He looked down at his hands. The broken blisters, the brass dust ground deep into the creases of his knuckles. He looked at the safe that had cost him 2 years and every dollar he owned, and he understood with terrible clarity that he might have just thrown away everything he had in the world for a box he was never going to open. The whole county had bet that he would fail. Marshal Coburn had laughed and let him keep his treasure, precisely, because Coburn was certain there was no treasure at all. And every soul in that barn had silently agreed with him. And maybe they were right. Maybe the boat anchor really was just a boat anchor. Maybe the story really was just the story, and his father really had been nothing but a thief the Lord had judged accordingly. And Elias was just a fool kneeling in the dark over a dead man's locked box, proving every laughing mouth in Hadley County correct. He felt the sting rise behind his eyes, and he let it come. There was nobody there to see. He bent forward until his forehead rested against the cold steel of the door, and he wept quietly. The way a person weeps when weeping is the only thing left available to do. It was the lowest point in a long life already full of low points. It was, in the language of old stories, the moment when everything seems lost. And it was right there, with his head against the metal and his hands gone completely still, that he remembered the rest of the sentence. Not Walt's voice, he understood even as it came to him. It was something Walt had said, but Walt had been quoting somebody else, the way the old man always quoted that one particular line whenever he'd had enough whiskey to grow honest and sad. Your daddy used to say, "You don't open a lock, you let it open. You stop fighting the thing and let it tell you where it wants to go." Elias had heard that 100 times and dismissed it 100 times as nothing but a drunk man's poetry. He wasn't wrestling with a clean lock. He was wrestling with a wounded one, and you do not fight a wounded thing. You don't force a wheel the fire has already broken. You listen to what it can still manage, and you ask it for exactly that, and nothing more. He lifted his head. He wiped his face with the back of his ruined hand, and he stopped trying to force the third wheel. Instead, he went back to the spindle itself, the warped central post, and laid 2 fingers on the dial so lightly he was barely touching it at all, closed his eyes, and let everything in his body go slack the way you do when you're trying to feel something very, very small. He wasn't turning the lock anymore. He was reading it, and what he read through his fingertips and the side of his face against the steel was that the seized wheel wasn't completely seized. It had perhaps a hair's width of play in it, the width of a held breath, before the fused metal stopped it cold. Not enough to bring the notch all the way around by turning alone. But maybe, just maybe, enough if he eased the spindle in the opposite direction at the very same instant, relieving the drag of the warp by a fraction, while he coaxed that last sliver of movement out of a wheel that refused to move. It wasn't anything he could have explained to another living soul. It wasn't anything he'd ever been taught. It rose up out of him from some place he hadn't known existed, the same place he would later think his father's hands must have once worked from, and he let it guide him. He eased the dial back with one hand and pressed with the lightest possible pressure on the spindle with the other, and he held his entire body still, and he waited, and he asked the broken thing for the one small movement it still had left to give. At 2 a.m, the last wheel gave it up. The notch traveled its final sliver and dropped into line, and Elias heard it clean and clear and impossibly sweet after all those hours of grinding, one bright sound cutting through the dark room. Click. For a moment he didn't move at all, afraid he had only dreamed it. Then he took hold of the door handle, the warped corner that had pulled away from the frame, and drew it open, and the bolt slid back, and the door of his father's safe swung open for the first time in 16 years. What waited inside didn't arrive all at once, and that turned out to be a mercy, because all at once might have been more than one exhausted boy could carry. The first thing he saw was the money. It sat in the bottom of the safe in neat banded stacks, the kind of cash that's kept, not spent. Beside it sat a folded sheaf of bearer bonds, worth their full face value to whoever happened to be holding them, and a small velvet roll containing a few fine pieces of jewelry. Elias touched it and pulled his hand back as if it had burned him. It was an enormous amount of money, more than he had ever seen, more than he had words for. And his first feeling, kneeling over it in the lamplight, wasn't joy. It was confusion, sharp and disorienting. This was not a stripped, looted hotel safe. This was not the soot and disappointment the auctioneer had promised. Why would any man let a fortune like this simply burn? Why had it sat untouched in a county for 16 years, while the whole town swore there was nothing in it worth the hauling? The second thing answered the first. Tucked upright against the side of the safe, positioned exactly where it would be found, sat an envelope. The fire had browned its edges but hadn't destroyed it, and across the front, written in a careful hand, were the words, "To be opened in the event of my death." Elias opened it with fingers that had stopped feeling their own pain. Inside was a single letter, the same careful handwriting, signed at the bottom by Harland Whitfield, the man who had owned the hotel, the same man who had died the night it burned. Elias read it once fast and once slow, and the second reading reshaped the entire world around him. The letter did exactly one thing, but it did it completely. It stated that Harland Whitfield, having no family left and no love whatsoever for the men who ran Hadley County, had decided exactly what was to become of everything he owned. He had written it down and locked it inside this safe so that no man could alter it before the law had a chance to read it. His hotel, his land, his fortune, all of it was to go to the town itself, held in trust for the building of a library, and a place of learning that any child in the county could use, regardless, the letter specified, of who their family was. He named the very men he did not trust to carry out his wishes, named them plainly, and wrote that he fully expected they would try to bury the document the moment they got their hands on it, which was exactly why he had locked it away where they couldn't. Elias sat there with the letter, and the money no longer looked like money at all. It looked like evidence. The letter wasn't the last thing waiting in that safe, and the very last thing wasn't meant for the law. It was small, slid down beside the bonds, where a hasty hand might have overlooked it entirely, and Elias's fingers found it only when he reached in to be certain he'd taken everything out. It was a roll of dark cloth, soft with age, and when he unrolled it across his knee in the lamplight, he found himself looking at a locksmith's tools, picks and tension wrenches, and a small brass-handled screwdriver. A working man's kit, well used, the handles worn into the shape of a hand that wasn't his own, and scratched into the brass handle of that screwdriver, carved in by the point of a knife the way a man marks a tool so it always finds its way home to him, were two letters, MC. Elias didn't need anyone to explain it to him. That was both the cruelty and the gift of it, that no letter spelled this part out, that there was no voice to hand him the answer and let him doubt it. He was a locksmith himself. He knew exactly what kind of wear a locksmith's hands leave behind, and he was holding the tools of a man who had worked them until the brass remembered the shape of his grip, and that man's initials were scratched into the handle, and that man's last name was his own. And slowly, in the dying lamplight, he understood exactly why those tools were sitting inside a safe, instead of out in the world where a working man keeps them close. Erland Whitfield had needed somebody he could trust completely to set the combination on this safe and lock his letter away where his enemies could never reach it. And in all of Hadley County, the man he trusted with that secret was a black locksmith with a rare gift in his hands. Marcus Carver had done the work the way Elias now understood. He did everything with care, and he had left his own kit sealed inside as the very last thing, before closing the door, not by accident, but the way a craftsman leaves his mark on something he knows will be discovered later. A locksmith's signature. Proof, for whoever finally opened it, of exactly whose hands had been trusted with the secret. And then the fire had come fast. From somewhere it had no honest reason to start. And Marcus had gone back into that burning hotel for the one thing a man like him would actually risk his life for. Not gold, not bonds. The truth he had just finished sealing away. The fire took him before he could carry it back out. The story the town had told for 16 years wasn't merely unkind. It was a lie, and a deliberate one, told on purpose by the very men Harland Whitfield had named in his letter, in order to bury a will that would have completely changed who got to learn and who got to grow wealthy in Hadley County. He had let a good man be remembered as a thief, because a thief made a far tidier story than a witness. And the proof of all of it had been sitting inside a box nobody could open, waiting 16 years for the one person in the whole world with the right hands and the right reason to finally open it. Elias closed his fingers around his father's tools. The lamp had nearly burned itself out. The window had started going gray at its edges, and somewhere past the rooftops, the town that had laughed at him the day before was beginning to wake up. He didn't feel like weeping anymore. He felt clear, steady, and for the very first time in his life, entirely like his father's son. Elias didn't sleep. He sat with his father's tools in his lap until the gray outside the window turned to gold, and once the town below had fully woken, he washed his ruined hands as best he could, wrapped the letter and the bonds and the tools together in the same dark cloth, and packed the money into the canvas feed sack he'd used the day before. Then he carried it all down the outside stairs and started up Larkin Street toward the county courthouse, walking the very same road he had dragged the safe down the evening before, only this time carrying what had been hidden inside it. Word of the auction had already traveled far enough that people who knew his face were out and about, and they watched this boy they had laughed at the day before walk up the middle of the street with a feed sack over his shoulder, and an expression that made more than a few of them go quiet without quite understanding why. By the time he reached the courthouse square, a small crowd had gathered behind him, drawn by the simple strangeness of it, half of them probably expecting the Carver boy to make a fool of himself one more time. His Marshal Coburn's white Cadillac sat parked across two spaces in front of the courthouse, and Coburn himself stood on the steps holding court with 2 county commissioners. He turned at the murmur of the crowd and watched Elias approach. "Well," Coburn called out, loud enough for the men beside him and the gathering crowd to hear, "if it isn't the richest fool in Hadley County. You get that boat anchor open, son, or did you just bring us a bucket of soot?" The crowd laughed, but it was a thinner laugh than the day before, because something about the way the boy walked had taken all the certainty out of it. Elias climbed the courthouse steps until he stood level with the commissioners, set the feed sack down, and opened the dark cloth across the wide stone railing, where everyone could see. He didn't speak a single word at first. He simply laid out, one piece at a time, everything the fire had failed to destroy: the banded cash, the folded bonds, the browned envelope with Harland Whitfield's careful handwriting across the front, and last of all, set apart from the rest, the worn locksmith's tools, with the initials scratched into the brass. The square had gone completely silent by the time he straightened back up. "Mr. Whitfield left a letter," Elias said, and his voice carried through the stillness better than any shout could have. "He wrote it himself, signed it, and locked it inside his own safe so the men he didn't trust couldn't make it disappear before the law could read it. He left everything he had to this town, for a library and a school any child in this county could use, no matter who their family was." He looked directly at the 2 commissioners as he said it, and one of them had gone the color of paper. He named the men he expected would try to bury it. "I imagine the law will want to read those names for itself." He set his hand on the worn tools. "And these belong to the man Mr. Whitfield trusted to lock that letter away. The man who went back into that hotel the night it burned, trying to carry the truth out with him. For 16 years this town has said Marcus Carver went into the Whitfield to steal. He didn't. He went in because a man needed a lock kept honest, and he was the one folks trusted to do it. He was my father, and he died in there keeping a promise that some of the very people standing in this square made sure nobody ever found out about." Nobody laughed now. Nobody said anything at all. It was Walt who finally broke the silence. The old locksmith had come out from his shop on Larkin Street, along with the rest of the town, and he stood at the edge of the crowd, and now he came forward through the people, slow with an old man's walk, until he reached the bottom of the steps. He looked up at Elias, then turned and looked at the commissioners, and at Marshal Coburn, and whatever he had been carrying for 16 years, he finally set it down. "You boys telling it true," Walt said. His voice was rough and not loud, but the square had gone so quiet it didn't need to be. "He's Marcus Carver worked beside me for 9 years. There wasn't an honest man in this county, and there wasn't a better set of hands. Harland Whitfield came to me when he wanted that letter locked away where these gentlemen couldn't reach it, and I sent him to Marcus, because Marcus was the one I trusted, and Marcus was the one who could make sure it stayed done." He looked at Elias, and something finally gave way in that old face that had stayed shut tight for 16 years. He knew. I knew what they said about him was a lie, and I held my tongue because I was afraid of these same men, and I have been ashamed of myself every single day since. He should have told you, son. I'm sorry I let you grow up hearing it. The thing the town had believed for 16 years came apart right there in the square, in the space of 2 men speaking. And there was no putting it back together afterward. What happened to Marshal Coburn happened slower than the laughter had, but it happened far more completely. The letter and the names in it went exactly where Elias said they would, straight to the law. And the law in those years was never quick to listen to a black teenager in a small southern town, but a signed will in a dead man's own hand locked inside his own safe, naming the very men who had spent 16 years rich off land that should have gone to a library, was not a thing that could simply be laughed off. It came out over the following months that Coburn had bought up the Whitfield land and the hotel ground for almost nothing in the confusion after the fire, bought it from a county that had no legal right whatsoever to sell it. Because Harland Whitfield had already given it away in a letter those same officials had pretended didn't exist. The fortune Marshall Coburn had built up and down Larkin Street had its very first stone laid on a buried will and a slandered dead man. He fought it the way men like him always fight, with lawyers and bluster and a great deal of noise about his good name. Yet the names written in Harland Whitfield's own hand could not be unwritten, and the worn tools with the scratched initials could not be unseen. And one by one, the people of Hadley County, who had spent 30 years being afraid of Marshall Coburn, discovered they weren't afraid of him anymore. The long white Cadillac went up for sale to cover what the courts said he owed. The storefronts went too. By the time the trust was settled and the land returned to the purpose Harland Whitfield had laid out for it, Marshall Coburn had nothing left in Hadley County but a name nobody would speak kindly, and he left the way men like that always leave, quietly, early in the morning, with no crowd to see him off. The last anyone in town ever saw of him, he had stopped his loaded car at the corner of Larkin Street, and Elias happened to be standing in the doorway of the locksmith shop, and for one moment the two of them looked at each other across a distance that had once felt like the entire weight of Hadley County, and was now only the width of a street. Coburn's mouth worked like he meant to say something, some final cutting remark to put the boy back in his place. But there was no word left that fit anymore. Whatever he had counted on his whole life, the certainty that he could read the true price of anything just by the look of it, had failed him completely the one time it actually mattered, and he knew it, and the boy knew it, and there was nothing left to say. Coburn looked away first. He drove off, and he never came back. The town did its reckoning the way towns always do, unevenly and incompletely, but it did it. The people who had laughed loudest in that auction barn were the quietest now, and some of them found their way to the locksmith shop in the weeks that followed, to say things to Elias that should have been said years earlier, and he received every one of them with the same steady patience he had once shown the steel itself, which is to say without bitterness, but without quite forgetting either. Harland Whitfield's wishes were finally carried out. The money built exactly what he'd wanted built, and over the door of it, by a vote that surprised no one, the town put a name. Not Whitfield's own name. Whitfield had asked for a library and a school, not a monument to himself. The name they placed over the door belonged to the man who had carried a secret into a fire, and let the town brand him a thief for 16 years rather than break a promise. The Marcus Carver Library and Learning Center, where any child in the county could come, no matter who their family was, exactly as the letter had asked. Elias would not take the money. There was a substantial sum the court ruled belonged to him by rights. The share Harland Whitfield's letter had set aside for the family of the man who had kept his trust, and Elias let every bit of it go into the building along with the rest. He kept only 3 things. He kept the auctioneer's receipt for $90, folded small and tucked into his shirt pocket, because a man should remember exactly what he had when he started, and exactly what he had been willing to risk it all on. He kept his father's tools, which he cleaned and oiled, and laid in the drawer of his own workbench in Walt's shop right beside his own. And he kept the safe. It stands today in the front hall of the new library, that same ugly fire-blackened safe that no man could open for 16 years, its warped door left standing open the way Elias left it that night, and beside it a small brass plate tells the part of the story that can be told in just a few words. The children walk past it every day on their way to the books, and most of them have no idea of the whole story, and that's perfectly fine. The safe stands open, and that's the thing it's there to say. Elias went back to the locksmith trade. He worked alongside Walt until the old man could no longer work at all, and then he ran the shop alone, the only locksmith left in Hadley County, with hands the years gradually filled in with the same gray graphite that had once stained his father's. Sometimes, walking home up Larkin Street in the evening, he would pass the library and catch sight of that open safe through the lit front window, and he would slow down and look at it a moment from across the street and let himself feel the quiet, steady pride of something done right at last, and a name finally set straight. Then he would go on home. Here is the thing worth carrying away from all of this. When a crowd laughs at someone for valuing what looks to everyone else like absolutely nothing, you have a choice about who you're going to be. You can spend your certainty cheaply, the way easy laughter always spends it, and add your own voice to the noise. Here you can find the decency and the patience to stand still, wait, and let that person eventually show you what they see. Because the price tag on a thing has never once been the truth of it, and the loudest voice in any room is almost never the one that actually bothered to look closely. Elias's entire life turned on a box the whole county had already decided was worthless, and the only reason the truth ever surfaced at all was that one boy was willing to listen when everyone else had already made up their mind. So here's a question I'd genuinely like to hear your answer to in the comments. Think back to a moment when someone in your life was laughed at, dismissed, or told that what they cared about was foolish, and they turned out to be right the entire time. Who was that person, and what did it teach you about waiting before you judge? Tell me about them. And if Elias's story moved you even a little, if you believe a person's worth was never the price tag the world tried to stick on them, share this with someone who needs to hear it today.